So we also are very delighted to be here, and I think that, Peter touched on so many important issues that I would want to, I think, in the roundtable talk more about, and so we won't, I'm not going to reiterate all of them, but just to say that I think that so many things that he talked about, they're very key. Certainly, the conversation about where housing is going, and Hans, in anticipation of the question you might ask later about the important questions to address in that roundtable, certainly Peter talked about designing for the city or not designing for sites, but designing for the city. And I would extend, or to sort of go a little bit further on that in a slightly different direction. We tend in the city to design also by neighborhoods rather than designing as a city. So that is certainly a question. But also to talk about affordability of housing. This is a huge issue downtown. Julian works at a different scale from what we are working at a different scale from what Peter and David presented. So we're going to come down in scale a little bit, but many of the same things apply in terms of what we're thinking about when we're designing these, and kind of livability, affordability, constructability, sustainability. All these things are things that we're thinking about. So now the other thing I'll say is that we in our practice design, we also design single-family homes, and we've done some for developer Great Gulf Homes, and also for Julian for Oben Flats at the townhome level. But certainly, if you ask a lot of people in the city, what's home? A lot of them are going to think about what I'm showing on the screen here. These are two streets in the Summerhill neighborhood, so just north of Yonge and Bloor. People are thinking about, they don't necessarily have to be detached, but they are traditional kind of Toronto lots. And this is one of the very special things about Toronto, is the nature of the fabric that we have here, that we have a lot of these beautiful kind of historic neighborhoods downtown. Something that you don't know about them, and that people who often buy them don't know about them as well, is that a lot of them were built, not necessarily the last 200 years. In fact, many of them are in actually pretty poor condition when you get into them and need a substantial amount of renovation. So the kind of idea, and at the time weren't necessarily particularly special houses to begin with in terms of the architectural detailing or styling, and certainly the constructability that I talked about previously. So, and yet, here's the thing about human beings. We all, we'd prefer not to change. A lot of us fear change. We prefer the status quo. And so the kind of alteration of these neighborhoods and what we consider what are called the avenues by the city, so streets like Dundas, Queen, College, are things that are really strongly, or can be resisted quite strongly by the neighborhoods that they're in, or neighborhoods that surround them. And so Julie and I are going to talk a little bit about that. It's a recent generation, and you heard David and Peter talk about millennials, and I sit on the design review panel for the City of Toronto, and certainly we see a lot of buildings where the millennials are the demographic for which the buildings are being targeted. But certainly, and the next slide is about and this is and for a lot of the millennials. This makes a lot of sense. To live downtown in a smaller building, they're not necessarily thinking of the house that we were showing in that previous slide, but they're thinking about this is what we can afford. We want to be downtown. We don't want to take the GO train and the things that Peter mentioned. And yet, those millennials grow up, right? Or they pair up, and then they start having families or having dogs, or they need to take in a parent, or they extended family of some description. And so, we have to simultaneously be thinking about a number, like this kind of diversity of housing that we need to be supplying in the city alongside the conversation about what's happening more strictly downtown. Mara, is that you? Hi. Toronto Community Housing is here, so I'm glad I'm talking about affordability. And they also don't think about, and also a classmate of mine from Waterloo and a good friend. We also don't think, this is our office here that you're seeing, and we're going to move into talking a little bit more, but away from these kind of typologies. This is our office here, and certainly people don't think about Main Street so much when they're talking about when they talk about home either. But let's be clear that on the top two levels of all of these houses, or all of these buildings on Dundas Street West, there are people living in them. And my partner, my business partner and husband and I and our two kids live on top of the one right in the middle there with the moldy wood siding on the front. Right, Julian? Kind of moldy. Yeah, it's disgusting, I know. It's appalling. It's character, yes. Thank you from the cheap sheets, my husband. So we also don't think about that. But certainly from the city's perspective, from a policy point of view, the avenues are one where we really do want to see development. They are well served by TTC. They're well served. We get an increasing number of bike lanes, and certainly well served by the sort of traditional or typical amenities one would need, like which is to say you can easily get a carton of milk. You can easily get whatever you need at the convenience store, and they're often well served by regional forms of transit as well, or connection to regional forms of transit. One of our employees, speaking of Georgetown, who is actually almost, I think she's around 40 years old, has decided to move out of the city and move to Georgetown because our office is right next to the GO station and the UP station that can link you to Georgetown because, for this reason, she found Toronto unaffordable. So these are the areas that we really need to be thinking about in greater, and the city, again, has targeted them for greater development and kind of intensification. And this is very much where Oben Flats has come into the picture. The problem with this, as we're going to talk to, is that there's a lot of resistance around it, and the economics of it are actually quite difficult. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of the townhome. These are the Oben Flat townhomes on Harbour Street that we did with Julian. And it's the only project that we've done with Julian that's actually a sale product. Everything else we are doing with him is a rental product. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of townhome development in Toronto, and then I'm going to give it over to Julian. Townhomes, again, are kind of quintessential Toronto building type. We've been building them since the mid-1800s. And the kind of typical lot back then, or the average lot, 15 feet wide by about 100 feet deep. And as we've developed as a city, the typical lot for this type of home has actually just gotten quirkier and weird. The kind of development areas for these, whereas we were just, they were just building the streets out at that point, like the kind of streets that we have now. The kind of sites that you get for this kind of multiple unit development now are just quirkier and quirkier, smaller, different sizes, these sorts of things. So, and the typologies that you get on them also very quirkier as well. So we get stacked townhomes, back-to-back stacked townhomes, all these one might say perversions of what was the traditional Toronto townhome. This site here. So imagine, I talked about the 15-foot wide on the front by the 100 feet deep. This one here, the overall block size is 90 feet wide for the whole thing and 60 feet deep. So 40 feet shorter than what you would have found on that, the block or the property from like the 18 or 1900, early 1900s. And then the individual units themselves 14 feet wide. So just a shorter, but also, of course, these are all attached as well. So that's a little bit of the history of townhome development in Toronto, but I think it's the right time to sort of segue over to talking about this project itself.
Sure. So Harbour Towns, which is what we called it, was an exciting project for us, and it really showed how through good design, you could overcome a lot of the obstacles that, at least initially, we thought we'd face, particularly in terms of the marketability of the project. For one thing, it didn't fit into our core business, as Meg mentioned, of building purpose-built rental buildings. Typically, we also build in the form of mid-rise or high-rise buildings, so this definitely was a lot smaller scale than what we were used to. So, yeah, new territory. But we did feel that, and the other issue with this site here is that it didn't really have the attributes you'd normally think of when you see or think about selling a high-end freehold townhome. But we thought we could overcome this if we really kind of put our heads together and came up with something that was innovative and really progressive and really design-centric, which incorporated high-end products and materials. We thought we'd at least find 6 people in the market that would appreciate what we did and would reward us for it. The problem is, in order to make this project happen, we had to really kind of break the mold and take a few chances that could have seriously backfired on us. The first thing was, Superkül designed this really bold facade that you see here. I think there's one more.
Yeah. Do you want?
Yeah. So. Yeah, it's quite bold and striking, and really daring, considering we'd have to sell these units. I can't count how many times our sales staff asked me to change the color of those front doors and channels to black or gray to kind of tone it down. But we stuck with the plan. The second thing we did was actually we didn't pre-sell these units. We were concerned that unless we showed and were able to have a potential buyer really see the finished product for themselves and experience the space, we didn't think we'd be that successful at the pre-sale stage. So we waited, we got the units completed and then launched. The third thing, and I think, go to the next slide.
The inside?
One more, yeah. Yeah, so here's just an idea of kind of what the interior looks like. Some nice millwork details. It's hard to, I think the picture got cropped here, but as Meg mentioned, it's 13-foot width on the inside. And when you're in it, though, it feels quite spacious. There's a lot of light coming from both the north and the south side. It's a nice quality product. The third thing we did, the third risk we took, which in the development world is a big no-no, is we self-finance the project. You're always taught that even if you've got the money, it's always better to use someone else's. The problem was here we couldn't convince an appraiser of what we thought we can get once the units were completed by taking this type of design-centric approach. So we went in it alone, and thankfully the project was a success. And I think that the fact that Meg and I are here talking to a bunch of architectural students and faculty, I think it says something. Financially speaking, we've done fairly well. As of today, we've sold 5 of the 6 units after having launched in last fall. And we're averaging over $1.3 million per unit. So we're pleased with that, obviously. The argument could be said that given the short supply or the scarce supply of housing, low-rise housing stock in the city today, another developer could have acquired the property. They could have built a development much less interesting than this for a lot less money, and probably could have sold these units for not much less than what we're getting in the market today. My hope is, however, that since we've proven that you can make a profit, and in some cases even more of a profit, by taking some of these design risks, developers may be more inclined to give their architects a little more creative latitude in the design process, which ultimately will make for a much more dynamic and diverse housing fabric in the city.
Yeah, so one of the, I went past this slide. One of the key, just as an addendum to what Julian's talking about, one of the key things to understand about this in that kind of larger conversation we're going to have about housing and affordability and diversity in the city is that Julian's we're working on a lot of gas station sites with Julian. And so these kind of marginal sites that have been laying dormant for a while, or fallow for a while, that are often of a strange dimension or an unusual, atypical dimension for these sorts of developments. And Harbour was very much one of these. The other addendum to that is to say that this is on one of those avenues that we talked about. And so I think from Julian's point of view, I think the additional risk is its location. And so when we talk about, is Harbour really, it's not, we're never going to posit it as a revolutionary project in the way that, you read in, you might read it on a website or something. It's more that it's gently nudging the envelope here on what it is that's considered acceptable as what is expensive housing ultimately in downtown Toronto. And this, it's on an avenue. You're right on the street when you get in. There's the site plan. You're right on the sidewalk when you're coming in the front door, and there's outdoor space on a deck above, but there's no backyard. So really sort of in some ways, not being on that main street and without the kind of conventions of a typical lot, an unusual house in that way. It segues really nicely into this conversation about affordability and what do you do on main streets into a conversation about mid-rise, which is the other the type of projects that we do with Julian. And some of these are all Oben Flats projects. First one's on Queen Street East, and it's going to be finished kind of soon, right?
Hope so.
Yeah.
June.
And then the second one is Oben Flats, Vaughan, which bears a striking resemblance to Peter's building on
Noticed
Sororan.
that.
But we did it first, I
one.
swear. Same black brick, there's that angled thing, yeah. And then this last one here, which is at Sherburne and Gerrard, which is going through, Vaughan, it's through its approvals process. Sherburne's going through a kind of raft of approval processes right now. We're going to focus on Queen Street, but before we do that, we're going to talk about mid-rise. And mid-rise in Toronto, and this is where I get up on my soapbox, and Julie and I talked about what we're going to talk about, and I said, I'm going to get up on a couple soapboxes, and this is one of them, mid-rise. Mid-rise, and I'll show you, this is from the City of Toronto mid-rise guidelines, which was a really intelligent document put together by Brooke McElroy. And in 2010, it was issued. And based on a whole raft of consultation with neighborhoods, policymakers, all sorts of things. And so these are basically the rules for developing mid-rise. Now, we could have a whole lecture and a whole seminar on mid-rise itself and the constraints of mid-rise, and does it work, does it not work, and certainly it's an ongoing conversation at the city. But these are some of the rules. Mid-rise is defined as those buildings roughly between 4 and 12 stories, okay? So, or 11 stories. 11? 12? I'm looking at my partner. 11 and a half. Yeah, it's based on the width of the right-of-way. But it is roughly in that in that range. And they are, this is the next slide with some of the statistics about it. This is one of the big issues with mid-rise, is that towers and mid-rise, and the city's well aware of this, Peter talked about a city the planning department under siege, and this is part of the siege. They are well aware of these issues, which is that towers and mid-rise take the same length of time to get approved in this city, and sometimes towers are easier to get approved. So, of the 61 projects approved between 2010 and 2014, 43 are on avenues. There should be probably a lot more on avenues, but we're seeing them in other areas. The economics, and Julian will talk more to this, but the economics of developing mid-rise are really hard. They're really hard to do. What they are conceived of is as being these kind of, like, they're smaller communities, like, 50 units, maybe 30 units, that sort of thing. And a lot of people find that really attractive as a smaller community, one where, we talked about people interconnecting units, not necessarily, at that stage right at the moment, because a lot of these haven't been built yet, but really from the point of view of that, you're going to recognize a lot of your neighbors, and there's kind of more of a kind of responsibility within the building of one neighbor to another. What is alarming to me and to us as a practice, is the kind of pushback on, first of all, there's the whole economic question which hasn't been resolved, but the pushback from City Council, the last fact that you'll see down there, that there was a motion made at City Council to actually, to basically ban mid-rise on stretches of Dundas, and there were a few other streets. They want to suppress that in Bloor Street West. They want to suppress it so that we actually can't get mid-rise there. And we'll talk a little bit more about the kind of march on downtown, but that is something of some alarm to us, because you say, well, where else are we going to be building, if we're not building point towers and we're not replacing all the homes on those single-family lots, where are we going to be building density in a sustainable way? Which leads us to Queen Street.
Sure. Okay. So, mid-rise developers like me, we have our fair share of challenges. There were two large obstacles that I thought I'd talk to you about today. One being as Meg mentioned, the municipal approval process. As it is, mid-rise buildings cost more per unit, I'd say on average, than do low-rise or high-rise buildings. And this is further exacerbated by the fact that the city, with all its talk, promoting mid-rise growth and the benefits of mid-rise growth in the city, they've really done nothing, and in fact have really failed to put in place any kind of mechanism to expedite the review and approval process of mid-rise applications. As far as they see it, as Meg had mentioned, a 6-story mid-rise building is the same as a 60-story high-rise tower. We have to submit the same reports by the same type of consultants. We're subject to the same timelines. So in effect, the city is actually discouraging mid-rise growth. and really preventing what I think could be an interesting and worthwhile alternative in housing in the city. To put this into context, so we acquired the property at 1075 Queen East in Leslieville in November of 2012. We had to go through a series of pre-consultation meetings with city staff, and I think we submitted our first rezoning application in April of 2013. It wasn't until December of 2014 that we were finally able to pull a building permit. And if we don't experience any construction delays between now and June, we're looking at a 3.5-year period between purchasing the property and seeing our first rental dollar. That's 3.5 years to produce or construct 48 residential rental units and barely 3,000 square feet of retail space on the ground floor. And while 3.5 years may seem like a long time to build 48 units, this timeline easily could have been extended by 6 months to a year had it not been for the community support, ironically, that we were able to generate to help push this proposal through the application process, which is the next point I wanted to talk about, and the next challenge, which is community opposition. The problem with mid-rise that we're seeing is that mid-rise reurbanization calls for intensification in areas that normally are located immediately adjacent to neighborhood zones. So and typically these zones really haven't seen much large-scale development ever. So in the eyes of these community members and locals, they see this as the idea of mid-rise really threatening the neighborhood and kind of destabilizing their identity forever. In our case, we initially proposed an 8-story building on that site, and this, as I mentioned, we sat down with the city on several occasions, and they were in full support of this 8-story proposal, primarily because we conform to the mid-rise guidelines. There's very little areas, there's one little bit on the top there where we're encroaching into that angular plane, but it more or less conformed. As soon as we brought this to the public, all hell broke loose. And the city, I should say the residents were up in arms. Rather than fight them on it, what we decided to do was engage the local residents and try to see if there was something we can do and adapt the design to make both parties happy. And what we learned in the process was that it wasn't so much the scale of the building or the GFA. It was more about how that mass was distributed within that built form. So in other words, it was okay if we stretched the building and pulled it back, so long as we were able to, if you flip to the next slide
I just want to point out that that's the encroachment that's when Julian's talking about the angular plane, that's the angular plane that's part of the mid-rise guideline. So the bits that are encroaching or poking through are these ones. So that's what was approved.
And just maybe for those of you who don't know, the planning department, when it comes to the mid-rise guidelines, that 45-degree angular plane, they swear by that. It's supposed to be a guideline, but to them it's basically gospel. You cannot encroach that angular plane. Even a guard, for instance, a balcony guard is a problem for them. So the whole idea of really stretching the building back and really encroaching that angular plane, we thought, let's give it a shot. So this is what we came up with. We managed to squeeze essentially the same amount of gross floor area into the 6-story building as we had in the 8-story proposal. As I mentioned, this would never pass and get support from the city planning department had it not been for the local residents who were terrified that we'd take our proposal to the Ontario Municipal Board, where we would have most undoubtedly won. But they appealed to the local councillor, who in turn put a significant amount of pressure on city planning staff to support our proposal, and fortunately they did. So like I said, we plan on opening our doors in June, and yeah.
So the last few slides I'm going to breeze through very quickly, but it's about me getting back on that soapbox and talking about how we have to really be thinking about the city as a whole and planning the city as a whole, not as neighborhoods, not as that downtown explosion. I forget what Peter had a good term for it, but we have to be thinking about all this connective tissue between the downtown and those stable residential neighborhoods, which is a technical term in city policy. So these are some slides from the city of Toronto. So this is the rate. This is downtown. So this is King and Spanana. This is the series of slides show the rate of development. So this is what, this was kind of the status quo before we started getting a lot of these development applications. This is what are currently under construction in the pink. These are with rezoning approved, and the star is on the Gary site, I think, isn't it? Yeah. And then this is what has been submitted. So this is what's under construction, this is what's been approved, and what's been submitted. It's a radical difference of what we've got downtown. And flipping back from that to an idea is like what these kind of micro units that we're talking about, what David was talking about, Peter and David were talking about, and what we do on how do we translate some of those smaller units that can be aggregated into larger units and think about them in a denser way on our avenues. This is where I'm doing a shout out to Daniel. This is a studio that I did last fall. Sorry, what did I say? Oh yes, sorry, not you, him. I'll talk about you later, okay? Yeah. Well, of course, there's a really, yeah. So this is Daniel's faculty option studio did last fall on housing, and this is Dundas Street West. This is by Jifeng Zhang, and his proposal for this incredibly dense kind of development with these micro units, and in a way that we have to start. His proposal. And now this is not buildable from a building code point of view, strictly speaking, but there's a lot of good thinking that went into this, and actually into the studio as a whole. I'm only choosing him because it actually is on Dundas, which is like one of the other projects that I showed. But also there's a particular complexity of thinking in his proposal about how you interlock units and how you create inside and outside space on an avenue in a way that promotes privacy, isn't all about glass walls everywhere, which is what we're getting on all these condos downtown, and actually has that sense of the kind of smaller within the larger. How do we create home? So he was imagining this world of these interlocked courtyard units, and again, we can't talk about it from an economic perspective because the economics of this kind of building just aren't there right now. But these aside from the building code issues, but these kind of interlocked courtyard units, again, thinking about how one might create this kind of density on these smaller sites without going to height. This is a whole other question at some level. But this, if you look at this drawing here, the kind of density here, and he's from he went to university in China previously, and I was looking at his drawings in one of our reviews, or at the desk crit, and I was like, Jaffe, these units are so small. Like how many people? It's like you can't even fit a bed in here. He's like, Meg. When I was going to school in China, we had 6 people in a room this big. You got to get around. You're thinking about what space is, right? He's like, this is a perfectly, this is a good size. This is going to be a beautiful unit because we can get natural light in there. We're not looking right into somebody else's. It's complex in a way that we haven't really imagined in a city like ours. And that's the note on which we thought we would leave it. Okay.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Julian, maybe a question for you. You don't have to tell me all the secrets of your trade, but it seems that you have a totally different model of financing your projects than others. So maybe you can say something about that.
Sure. So my business partner and I, it was about 7 or 8 years ago, we have a sister company which contains a number of existing purpose-built rental buildings in the portfolio. We were looking at these older purpose-built rentals built in the 60s and 70s, and we were thinking if we wanted these to last another 20, 30 years, there was going to be some major capital expenditures that would have to be incurred, millions of dollars. re-roofs, new windows, new electrical, mechanical systems, the work. So then that kind of triggered, question, well, can we build a new rental building? And so there was a whole process involved in that. And at the time, this is when the city was booming. We were looking at the condo market and realizing that a lot of the condos that were being purchased were by investors, 30, 40, 50%, which they would then rent back out to the market. So we thought, well, if it works for them, after they're paying basically a premium, it should be able to work for us, building purpose-built. So that's basically what we did was we sold those old buildings and used that as our capital to finance our current. Now, we don't self-finance everything. It was just in this case, Harbour, where because of some of the marketing challenges, financing challenges, we kind of went in it alone, but that's kind of how we got into our business.
Mm-hmm. Meg, you were talking about affordability, and you have this very passionate plea for mid-rise, but there's a strange tension, of course, affordable and mid-rise. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah,
How can you solve that?
Well, so a lot of what we see is a lot of developers now moving into rental, and it's not that rental. I mean, it's not. This all came out of and Julian and I have had this conversation about family members or friends who have been looking for affordable places in the downtown core and not being able to find them. And so I don't think that we have the answer to that. I think rental is part of the answer to that in some ways, because and also, but certainly the struggle in the city the city was hoping really that the changes to the Ontario Building Code, which allows 6 stories in wood construction, would help change that kind of the cost benefit, or the sort of inherent cost of building units. But the truth is that it'd be very hard to do mid-rise in wood frame construction. So that, the jury's out on that one right now, just because of the complexity of how you have to jog the building in and out and actually to achieve the angular planes and the setbacks that are required by that are suggested by the mid-rise guidelines. So I don't know that we have the answer to that yet, but I think that we as a city and as a kind of community, a larger community within the city, have to be thinking about, and we're not just talking about families, we're talking about students, we're talking about older folks, all these folks who can't find something that's decent to live in within the downtown core, people who generally just have either don't have a car and they can't be driving in from somewhere, or they actually can't afford to take the GO train necessarily. They really would be better off taking, they need to be able to take the TTC. So it's still very much an open question, one that we haven't, I don't think that we have the answer to, but in the long term, through policy, we have to, and through, which is to say that, shortening the approvals times for some of these projects might be part of the solution, so that we can actually, we're not spending so much time carrying the properties and going through these lengthy approval processes where we have to hire developers have to hire planners and all these other consultants in order to get the thing through. That the idea, or through policy that is inclusionary, which is to say, like, there are cities where it's mandated that you have to have a certain percentage of affordable housing. We're not there yet, but I think it's certainly something that we haven't gotten out in front of, and that we have to do. And TCH is of course providing. But we don't have that we don't really yet have that full diversity of housing that I think that we need. And to that earlier question about gender or seniors housing, all this big question about where policy, affordability, all the economics of it are going to lead us in terms of the next 50 years of providing accessible housing, and I mean that in the broadest sense, accessible housing close, like on TTC lines, close to downtown, so that people aren't traveling, like an hour every morning to get to their jobs because they can't afford to live a little bit closer. It's a huge issue, I think.
Julian, is for you this mid-rise a niche in the market, or is it ideology? Is it your model of the city?
Yeah, a bit of both.
Yeah.
Going back to that, when we started looking at the idea of doing rentals, we just didn't want to build another rental building, replicate what was built back in the 60s and 70s. And we spent a lot of time looking at creating a brand that was based on And a lot of what David had said about design and being contemporary, being cool, kind of attracting kind of the urban indweller. So that was kind of at the forefront. And then we also thought at the time, well, it's kind of hard to create this kind of cool community environment. At least we thought maybe with 400 units. So we wanted to keep it boutique and smaller. And practically speaking, we also didn't want to put all our eggs in one basket and start with 400 unit rental building right out of the gate. So we started small. We purchased Queen and some of the other properties you saw up there. But as we're going through the process, we're quickly realizing that the economics aren't there, whether it's rental or condo. And actually, it's a little easier for a rental developer to make these mid-rise projects work because it's a very different economic model that we work on. If we were selling these units.
Can you explain that a bit? What's the difference?
Well, sure. I mean, our time horizons are 20 years, 15, 20, 30 years. So, we look at, income, annual income over the course of that period, as opposed to compared to a developer that's looking for that, that profit at the end of the project and needs that return of, 10, 15, 20%. I don't think that exists anymore, but it's, they got one shot at it. We can kind of amortize those costs over a longer period of time. And we also benefit from the appreciation and the increase of value by holding onto that property over time. Mm-hmm. And to give you a sense, one of the buildings we sold 7, 8 years ago, what we sold, so the annual income that last year we owned it was the same amount of what it cost to build that building 30 years ago. So it gives you a sense of if you can stay in the game long enough, that's when you kind of reap the rewards.
Mm-hmm. Yes, question over there. Wait for the microphone, please.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was wondering if you could say something about the commercial space in the buildings, in mid-rise buildings, or in any of your projects. I didn't hear it spoken to at all, and of course, if we're talking about dwelling and amenity and being close to things, this is essentially an equal factor in the development of the building because it's the whole community plane. And some of the resistance that's being seen in parts of the city is because there's actually a fear of homogenized commercial space that's maybe inflated in its prices. So in a sense, very predictably only bringing in national franchise entities or others, or in the case of the rules being too tight in the city, the inability, for example, to grow working spaces in Leslieville on Queen Street to actually save people the commute into downtown. And so I'm just wondering where your thinking is in terms of the commercial spaces, room for innovation, and how they can fuel the growth of mid-rise or the projects you do.
Sure. Commercial space is a funny thing. In some developments, you make or break a development with the commercial space, depending on your location. In our case, you'd think that having commercial space available right on Queen Street is a great thing. But when you're dealing with such small sites, and you've got lobbies to think about, exit stairs and services and all that stuff that you got to fit within that ground floor plate, we end up kind of carving out a space for commercial. But what you'll find out in the process is that commercial tenants have a very kind of strict criteria in what they're looking for. So if you don't have the right width of structure, or if you do a certain amount of storefront, if it's not deep enough, if it doesn't have proper access, which is all difficult to satisfy in a format like this, you don't get the type of commercial tenant you're looking for. I mean, we're not looking, because of our brand and our brand and keeping that integrity of the brand, we're not putting a Subway, a sandwich shop in there or a Shoppers Drug Mart. We're looking for a local type of, say, cafe or something interesting like that, which they can't afford the lease rates that we'd like to see, that initially we had in our pro forma. We know if we want a certain tenant, we're not going to get that. We see it as, not in this case, not necessarily a loss leader, but it's something more to complement the building and what we're trying to create there, as opposed to another source of income for our a rental income in that sense.
Same question for you as to the previous two speakers. What's your standard of dwelling? Why were you excited to be speaking here? Because you have this definition of standard.
Yeah, I think if the city, and actually in the mid-rise guidelines, there is a section about recommendations, and in the recommendations, they have this big kind of piece about this mechanism I talked about to expedite the review process. But I mean, it looks like the city's kind of picked what's kind of punitive to developers and left out what would actually help us. But if they could create something like that and encourage more mid-rise growth, I think there's some interesting things that could be done on these avenues. Because it is an interesting building form. And I think you get more of a community environment in a smaller type of building like this than you do in a 30 or 40-story tower.
So you're saying that the mid-rise should become a standard?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Meg?
I mean, I think, designing a house or a home is one of the most intimate and kind of interesting projects for architects, or at least it is from my perspective. And I think that because it's such a fundamental building block of a city and of our lives. And the opportunity that we have now, that we have in Toronto and we've had for the last number of years, to actually fundamentally to increase the kind of the opportunity to increase the livability of our city has been huge, and I think never unmatched in recent memory in terms of its importance. The kind of level or the rate at which we're doing it, and we got to get it right. And I don't think any conversation about this is too late, because it's still happening, and I don't think that we are consistent. We certainly aren't consistently getting it right, nor are we hitting all the right notes. So I think that housing as a conversation is one of the most important conversations that we can be having in a faculty of architecture in 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018. Not only in a city like Toronto, but by extension, in a world that is increasing. Like every year we hear the same stats, like the world is now 60% urbanized or whatever it is now. And we're going to continue to hear that as our populations migrate to urban centers. So, it seems like a simple thing to do. But from what you've already seen and what you'll see with Pina and Neil too, is that it's not that simple. Clearly, there are so many things that push and pull on the creation of home in our cities that it's an ever evolving kind of conversation and dialogue, not only here but in places, just about anywhere. And that's why I think that it's a conversation that, I hope we just continue to have through forums like this, but also in our studios. And one that you engage in a really robust way.
Okay, I think one final question here.
Hi, my name is Lisbeth. I had a question in regards to the live and work, because you briefly mentioned it, but not as far as how that plays a part in the standard of dwelling coming forth, and also within your work in the mid-rise buildings. Also because a lot of these properties do get taken over to get developed into higher density.
Well, I mean, live work is, what we see in studies is that people, increasing numbers of people are spending their time, increasing amounts of time working out of their homes, and the demographics around that have changed, and through flex time and stuff like that too. I think the idea of these, and ultimately we have to sort of reflect that against or in a conversation about flexibility and what is truly flexible. Ultimately, I think there's I have an anecdote about a project that we did for Great Gulf Homes, and we were designing a prototypical sustainable suburban home for them. And they gave us some standard plans from their other projects, and they said, these are the types of projects we do. And Andre and I were looking at these plans and scratching our heads. We're like, what are all these rooms, and why is there a family room on the second floor? We've already got one downstairs, and then there's this big room down there, and there's and so we asked Tad from Great Gulf. He's like, Meg, Andre, these houses, yeah, they're huge, but it's because there's mom and dad are living there with their kids, the grandparents are coming, there's this huge, and so these things that look to us to be the most kind of prosaic, cookie cutter houses are in fact these incredibly flexible dwellings, live, work, dwelling, family, intergenerational houses that were existing out there sort of right under our noses. I think what Julian's been able to do in the Oben Flats projects is that you do get a slightly higher mix of larger bedroom houses, which people can then either use, they can use as an office, one of the rooms as an office while they're if they don't have kids, and then if they have kids or they accept somebody else into their family, there's that. So ultimately it's a choice. I mean, some people are never gonna want to work in their house, or their work doesn't allow for that. But certainly if this kind of notional idea of flexibility is one that, in designing a good home, which is one that's about massing and proportion in good sized spaces, you get as much flexibility in that as you possibly can, and that's what allows for these kind of different uses this multiplicity of uses that I think you're talking about.
Okay, thank you very much. We take another 5-minute break, and then we go to the third panel.